Few places have been as terrifying as the Nazi concentration camps of World War II. They were the scene of the senseless slaughter of human beings on a scale never before seen, and suffering was part of their daily operation. It's shocking to think that some of the most perverse and sadistic acts that occurred in the concentration camps were carried out not by guards or SS officers, but by doctors in white coats. Who were these doctors from hell, who violated their Hippocratic Oath by experimenting on live human beings? What were some of the most horrific tests they subjected prisoners to? From enduring freezing temperatures stark naked to being intentionally inoculated with deadly diseases, from being thrown from great heights to having their organs harvested while still alive, prisoners in the concentration camps suffered unimaginable torment at the hands of these so-called medical professionals. Worse than death, human experiments in concentration camps. The entire Nazi ideology, as developed by Adolf Hitler from the 1920s onward, was based on the idea that some human beings are superior to others due to their genetic makeup. Hitler was particularly influenced by the scientific concept of eugenics, the belief that genetics could be improved generation after generation to create superior human beings. Eugenicists sought to make new humans stronger, more intelligent, resilient, and more beautiful. The Third Reich employed thousands of doctors involved in eugenics theory. It was so popular that Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS and responsible for all concentration camps in the Reich, considered the camps to be the ideal place to carry out eugenic experiments. After all, they provided a nearly endless source of test subjects, and since they were already prisoners, it would not be unethical to experiment on them. In the concentration camps, the doctors were almost kings, as revered as the camp commandants. Many of these doctors even belonged to the SS, alternating between wearing their white coats and black SS uniforms. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, had great appreciation for the doctors and tried to attract as many of them as possible to Auschwitz. He considered them absolute authorities on their camps. The camp commandant listened to them attentively, asked their advice, and heeded their proposals for genetically improving the Aryan race. Höss was proud of Nazi ideology and wanted to turn Auschwitz into a cutting-edge scientific experimentation center. Furthermore, knowing that the Führer was openly vegetarian, he emphasized that it was not necessary to harm innocent animals to conduct racial improvement experiments. The hundreds of thousands of prisoners at Auschwitz would provide the perfect raw material for science. The prisoners were indiscriminately used as instruments in the service of the Reich. Not only did they constantly die working day and night in inhumane conditions, but they were now also turned into laboratory rats. The Nazis were obsessed with the pursuit of medical knowledge and believed that the ability to conduct experiments freely, without the need to follow ethical and legal rules, was a blessing. Thus, many doctors who began working in the concentration camps initially had sincere scientific ambitions, only to become sadistic monsters within the camp walls, devoid of humanity or compassion. Names like Mangala, Wirths, Schumann, and Klauberg became synonymous with death and suffering. They were also highly regarded in the Third Reich, and their research promised miraculous results. Large companies and corporations like Bayer also profited from the slave labor and medical research conducted on the prisoners. IG Farben, Bayer's parent company, even set up a manufacturing facility right next to Auschwitz. Prisoners at Auschwitz were regularly sold to the Bayer company as laboratory rats for testing new drugs. Records show that 150 women were sold in 1942 and transported from the camp's infamous Block 10 to the laboratory facility. All 150 women died at the hands of Bayer scientists during experiments with a new anesthetic. Unfortunately, most of the documents proving the illegal and immoral experiments conducted at private companies have been destroyed or ignored by the press. However, it is clear that corporations profited enormously from human experimentation and forced labor in the camps. The future looked very bright for everyone in the Reich, except for those considered inferior due to their genetic makeup. Himmler's army of doctors was ordered as early as 1941 to scour the concentration camps for those unable to work or otherwise undesirable, resulting in a large number of deaths from the poison gas Zyklon B. One highly respected doctor, Professor Fischer, openly stated that Jews were a different species, not human. Therefore, experimentation on them was permitted. In January 1942, A large contingent of doctors and nurses, both men and women, was sent to Poland to establish an extermination camp at Chełmno. In December of that year, Dr. Julius Halevorden reported that during the summer he had been able to dissect the brains of 500 mentally handicapped patients. By 1944, he had a collection of 697 brains, some from people who had been murdered solely for the purpose of brain study. The sadistic doctors of death in Nazi Germany. Halevorden's collection of human brains was alarming, but perhaps the most monstrous man ever to work in a concentration camp was a doctor named Yseph Mangala. A harmless, even innocent-looking man, Mangala became famous during his time at Auschwitz. His work at the concentration camp would inaugurate one of the most perverse chapters of those years at Auschwitz. When he arrived at Auschwitz in March 1943, he was a handsome young man of 32. Very soon his name would become synonymous with horror. Always dressed in an immaculate SS uniform, with a firm gait and a charming smile, Mangala loved to pace the corridors of Auschwitz, always accompanied by his colleagues in white coats. His behavior was erratic, and he often had violent mood swings. Mangala's main research focused on twins, as his dream was to find a way for pure Aryan women to have more than one child at a time. To pursue this goal, he used Auschwitz as his laboratory and the poor Polish and Roma children as his test subjects. Doctors Karl Klauberg and Horst Schumann conducted medical research on sterilization, which was the other side of the fertility continuum. Schumann was one of the doctors involved in the euthanasia program that the Nazis had developed at the Sonnenstein extermination camp. When Klauberg and Schumann arrived at Auschwitz in 1941, Block 10 was divided in two. Klauberg oversaw one half and Schumann the other. In Schumann's section, there were huge X-ray machines where the unfortunate prisoners were subjected to sterilization experiments. There, men and women were exposed to X-rays for long periods that caused excruciating pain in their intestines, and it was reported that some nurses vomited at the terrible sight under Schumann's impassive gaze. The X-rays left them with severe radiation burns to their abdomens, groins, and buttocks, as well as festering lesions that resisted healing. At a time when women were scarce, either because they were destined for prostitution and turned into sex toys for the hierarchs or because they had been murdered, the nurses themselves were often subjected to the abominable Dr. Schumann's experiments. Klauberg attempted other types of sterilization methods. He attempted chemical sterilization using injections. The nurses working with him had the brutal task of injecting experimental chemicals directly into the women's uteruses. The women were made to lie down, and the nurses held their legs apart while Klauberg and his medical team examined their uteruses to ensure the injections had been administered correctly. Himmler himself was personally interested in the results of the sterilization experiments these doctors had initiated under Rudolf Höss. Himmler believed that sterilization was a powerful tool for solving the Jewish problem and that it would be far better and more effective than the notorious gas chambers. At the Führer's residence at Wannsee, Himmler proposed that it would be cheaper to sterilize German Jews than to deport them en masse. Klauberg promised Höss and Himmler that he would find the cheapest and most effective method for the Reich, but in practice he failed to achieve the desired result. All he succeeded in doing was causing pain and death to countless human guinea pigs. Schumann and Klauberg were two monstrous, bloodthirsty doctors, but they weren't the only ones who performed experiments. Another such exponent was Edward Wirths. He was the chief physician at Auschwitz. Wirths also enjoyed performing forced experiments on women to investigate the functioning of the cervix. Danish endocrinologist Carl Vernet developed an artificial male sex gland, a capsule that slowly released testosterone when implanted under the skin. In 1944, Vernet proposed to Reich SS sub-physician Ernst Robert Grawitz that the capsule could convert homosexual men to heterosexuality. At Buchenwald concentration camp, with the support of Heinrich Himmler and camp doctor Gerhard Schiedlowski, Vernet implanted capsules in at least 10 homosexual prisoners. Prisoners seeking release from the camps claimed that these capsules miraculously converted them heterosexual, and Vernet was pleased with the results. However, this method was never implemented as the war ended the following year. Experiments with ice water and seawater. Another major goal of Nazi experiments was the development of super soldiers. It was believed that pure German Aryans were already superior to the rest of the world, but that they could be further improved through scientific experimentation. For example, Hitler wanted to find a way for soldiers to be better fighters in extremely cold or very hot climates, and even to survive in an environment where the only available water was salt water. These skills would come in handy as World War II expanded to extreme climates like North Africa and Norway. Sigmund Rasche, a Bavarian physician and member of the Nazi Party since 1933, was obsessed with studying the human body's responses to extremely cold temperatures. He performed so-called freezing experiments on behalf of the Luftwaffe on 300 test subjects without their consent. Most of these experiments were requested of Rasche by Erich Hippke, the Luftwaffe's chief surgeon. Hippke didn't want to get his hands dirty, so he sent Rasche to Dachau with strict orders to inform him of all the results. The experiments were conducted at Dachau, where the Luftwaffe also carried out the infamous high-altitude experiments. The goal was to determine how best to warm German pilots who had been shot down over the North Sea and were suffering from hypothermia. Rasche's victims were forced to remain naked outdoors in freezing temperatures for up to 14 hours or kept in a tank of ice water for 3 hours. Their pulse rates and internal temperatures were measured using an array of electrodes. Once the victims were on the verge of dying from hypothermia, the second phase of the experiment began. Attempts were made to warm the victims through various methods, the most common and successful being immersion in hot water. A witness testified at the Nuremberg trials that some victims were thrown into boiling water to revive them. Needless to say, many subjects died in this process. However, the majority of subjects who were forced to remain naked outdoors in sub-zero temperatures survived, although during the process they screamed in pain as their bodies froze. In 1942, Rasche conducted an intense cooling experiment at Dachau where some subjects were dressed in fighter pilot uniforms and immersed in ice-cold water. Rasche had some of the victims completely submerged and others only up to their heads. Heinrich Himmler himself attended some of the experiments and told Rasche that he should go to the North Sea region to find out how ordinary people warmed victims of extreme cold. Himmler told Rasche that he had heard stories about fisherwomen nursing their half-frozen husbands in their beds to revive them. Himmler believed that something he called animal heat had a different effect than artificial heat. There is reason to think that Rasche did not believe that what Himmler was proposing was correct, but even so, he was the senior SS officer. Immediately, 4 Roma women were sent from the Ravensbrück concentration camp to Dachau, where an attempt was made to warm the hypothermia victims by placing them between 2 naked Roma women. The frostbite and cold resistance experiments conducted at Dachau were part of a series of official studies carried out between 1941 and 1942 under the supervision of the Luftwaffe, German Air Force, and the Sanitätswesen der Waffen, SS, Medical Service of the Armed SS. The tests were carried out in a specially adapted facility within the camp's medical block, known as the High Altitude and Thermoregulation Experimental Station, located near the crematorium. This station contained 2 cylindrical steel tanks, one used for ice water immersion and the other for hot water resuscitation tests. The standard duration of each test was between 60 and 180 minutes, depending on the method used. In the main protocol, prisoners were stripped, immobilized, and gradually immersed in water with a temperature between 2 and 5 degrees Celsius. Vital signs, rectal temperature, heart rate, and neuromuscular reflexes were recorded. Once the threshold for profound hypothermia, below 27 degrees Celsius body temperature, was reached, various recovery methods were applied. These included thermal blankets, direct heating with infrared lamps, controlled hot water baths, and, in the final experiments, body rewarming through physical contact. The following doctors, Dr. Ernst Holzlöhner and Dr. Erich Finke from the University of Kiel, were involved in these tests, acting on behalf of the Luftwaffe. Holzlöhner designed the basic protocol, while Finke oversaw the recording of data and the autopsies in the event of death. Monthly technical reports were produced and sent directly to the Institute for Aviation Medical Research, headed by Hubertus Strughold in Berlin. At a confidential conference held in Nuremberg in October 1942, these doctors presented their results under the title Study on the Reactions of the Human Organism to Immersion in Cold Water, without revealing that the subjects were forced prisoners. The seawater experiments were directed by Dr. Hans Eppinger, chief physician at the University Hospital of Vienna, with support from the Reich Ministry of Health. The test subjects were divided into 3 groups: untreated seawater, seawater chemically treated with berkettit, an experimental desalination additive, and a control group with access to drinking water. For over 3 weeks, the test group prisoners survived on only saline or treated liquids, resulting in severe kidney damage, vomiting, diarrhea, hallucinations, and in many cases, death. These experiments were recorded under the file Dachau Bericht 139A/1944, now partially preserved in US archives after being seized at the end of the war. From approximately July 1944 to September of the same year, experiments were conducted at the Dachau concentration camp to study various methods of making seawater drinkable. These victims were deprived of all food and given only filtered seawater. At one point, approximately 90 Roma were deprived of all food and given only seawater to drink at the hands of Dr. Hans Eppinger, which left them severely injured. They were so dehydrated that they began licking the freshly mopped floors in an attempt to get drinking water. A Holocaust survivor named Yseph Mangala was one of the test subjects in the seawater experiments at Dachau. While working at the medical experimentation stations, he gained knowledge about some of the experiments being performed on prisoners, particularly those where they were forced to drink salt water. Mangala also described how the victims of the experiments had trouble eating and would desperately search for any source of water, including old rags from the floor. Mangala was in charge of using the X-ray machine in the infirmary and describes how, although he had knowledge of what was happening, he was powerless to stop it. He gives the example of a patient in the infirmary who was sent to the gas chambers by Sigmund Rasche simply because he witnessed one of the experiments. Exploding people, a more humane method of killing. The cruelty of the concentration camps was so extreme that Nazi psychologists constantly treated soldiers and guards who complained of traumatic experiences. They were forced to witness or carry out horrific killings, which caused horrific nightmares and panic attacks. Many soldiers became psychologically ill as a result of the killings, experiencing visions of the massacres they had participated in. As a result of these protests and what he had personally witnessed, Himmler ordered the search for a killing method that would cause fewer psychological problems for his men. Consequently, a few weeks later, a doctor, Albert Widmann, an SS second lieutenant at the Technical Institute of the Criminal Police, traveled east to Minsk to conduct experiments. Previously, Widmann had been instrumental in developing a gassing technique used to murder mentally ill patients in what became known as Action TV. Now he would take his experience eastward. Incredibly, one of the first methods Widmann tried to improve the murder process in the Soviet Union was to blow up his victims. Several mentally ill patients were placed in a bunker along with packages of explosives. At the commander's command, his subordinates detonated the packages, but it was later discovered that the charge was not powerful enough. The scene was horrific. The explosion had not made the people disappear, as had been announced. Some of the wounded crawled out of the shelter, crying. Shortly after, the bunker where the prisoners were placed had totally collapsed. Body parts were left scattered on the ground and hanging from trees. The next day, a group of soldiers from the concentration camp was sent to collect the body parts and throw them back into the bunker. Those parts that were too high in the trees were left there to rot, with no regard for the dignity of the people who had been killed. Widmann learned from this gruesome experiment that murder by explosion was clearly not the method Himmler had intended, so he searched for another method. After several months of deliberation, he came up with a solution. The adult euthanasia program had successfully used bottled carbon monoxide as a murder method, but it was impractical to ship large quantities of these cylinders thousands of miles. Perhaps Widmann and his colleagues thought there was another way to use carbon monoxide to kill. Weeks earlier, Widmann and his boss, Dr. Walter Hess, had been sitting in a Berlin subway car chatting about the fate that had nearly befallen a colleague named Arthur Niebuhr. He had driven his car back from a party, having drunk too much, parked in his garage without turning off the engine, and fallen asleep. As a result, he nearly died of carbon monoxide poisoning from the exhaust fumes. Before the final development of Zyklon B as a method of mass extermination, the authorities of the Third Reich carried out numerous technical tests to optimize the final solution in an efficient manner and with minimal psychological impact on the perpetrators. One of the key institutions in this phase was the Kriminaltechnisches Institut der Sicherheitspolizei, the Institute for Criminal Technology of the Security Police, subordinate to the Reich Security Main Office, RSJ. This Berlin-based institution was run by technicians and chemists who worked closely with SS doctors and euthanasia program leaders. Between 1940 and 1942, under orders from Reinhard Heydrich, trials began with mobile gassing trucks, used as an intermediate solution between mass shootings and the future fixed chambers. The first operational model was implemented in Chelmno, Kulmhof, Poland in December 1941. These were closed Magirus-Deutz-type trucks, modified to redirect the engine exhaust gases to the rear compartment, where between 50 and 70 people were confined at a time. The standard model used V8 gasoline engines, whose carbon monoxide emissions were lethal after 10 to 20 minutes of continuous exposure. This method was initially tested at Belzec in the spring of 1940, with the support of technicians from the Criminal Institute. The victims were primarily psychiatric patients and Polish Jews. At least 5 different versions of adapted trucks were documented, with variations in load volume and gas pressure. Tests showed that the efficiency of these vehicles was reduced by ambient heat and by the agitation of prisoners, who blocked the gas outlets with their bodies. For this reason, they were modified with metal interior plates for easier cleaning, and reinforced, written by engineers from the Kriminaltechnisches Institut, were forwarded to the Reich Ministry of the Interior and the staff of the action program Reinhard. This technology was later transferred to camps such as Sobibor and Treblinka, where it temporarily coexisted with more advanced methods of fixed gassing. The technical evolution of mass murder by exhaust gas laid the groundwork for the implementation of more stable systems, such as Zyklon B, whose effectiveness and storage capacity would make it the standard for industrialized genocide. It seems that the memory of his intoxicated colleague motivated Widmann to attempt a gassing experiment using the exhaust fumes from a car connected by a pipe to the brick basement of a psychiatric hospital in Mogilev, east of Minsk. Several hospital patients were locked in the room, and the car's engine was started. Initially, the test was unsuccessful from the Nazi point of view. Not enough carbon monoxide flowed from the car to kill the patients, even when they waited for several hours. This was remedied by replacing the car with a truck. This time, the experiment was a success from the Nazis' perspective. The prisoners in the basement fell unconscious to the ground in less than a minute, and sometime later they were all dead. Himmler was extremely pleased with the outcome of this experiment. Widmann had discovered a cheap and effective way of killing people that minimized the psychological impact of the crime on the killers. Widmann's experiments, first with explosives and then with carbon monoxide, were the preliminary steps that led to the most infamous method of killing people in mass numbers. In 1941, the first gas chamber tests were conducted. After I.G. Farben invented the gas known as Zyklon B, the method was perfected. Between 1942 and 1945, Zyklon B was responsible for the deaths of over 1 million people in Europe, not only at Auschwitz, but also at other camps, such as Majdanek. For this reason, in 1947, the US government imprisoned 9 of I.G. Farben's directors for war crimes. Mangala's sick obsession with twins. Mangala's main interests was twin experimentation. He believed that if there was a way to help German women conceive twins, the Aryan population growth rate would double. Nazi scientists were obsessed with finding ways to improve the fertility rate of German citizens while decreasing births to other groups. Eventually, they thought the world would be completely populated by the Aryan race, which they believed to be superior to all others. But in the case of Yseph Mangala, there was another factor driving his experiments. He was a highly sadistic man, and he enjoyed exerting power and inflicting pain on others. Mangala's experiments on twins included the amputation of healthy limbs, deliberate infection with diseases such as typhus, blood transfusions from one twin to the other, and sewing twins together to create conjoined twins. The results of his experiments, along with his reasons for performing them, were painstakingly recorded in his notebooks, although most of these documents were destroyed when the Allies were about to take over the Auschwitz concentration camp. Eva Moses Kor, one of the few survivors, claimed that Mangala was particularly interested in cross-sex blood transfusions between twins of opposite sexes. He apparently thought this could be a way to change their sexes. For this reason, he also experimented on the twins' genitals and even attempted to join the urinary tract of a 7-year-old girl to his own colon. Most of the twins died during these procedures, although this was not a problem for Mangala. Mangala's experiments were not carried out improvisedly, but within an organized and documented framework, with statistical and administrative procedures typical of the Third Reich's medical apparatus. Mangala and his team kept coded clinical records for each pair of twins with detailed records including weight, height, bone proportions, muscle development, heart rate, growth pattern, and even observed psychological characteristics. This information was processed by technical assistants recruited from among German medical prisoners and students sent by Allied institutes to the racial research program. These assistants compiled data on standardized forms, which were then sent to Berlin to the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene, one of the entities that centralized scientific data on human eugenics. Furthermore, in Block 10 at Auschwitz, internal orders governing access, subject classification, and the sequence of tests were maintained. The instructions were signed by senior SS doctors and endorsed by the Main Office for Race and Resettlement. Mangala also coordinated directly with the SS Central Archive on Race and Population, which managed thousands of files with family history, ethnic origins, and previous biometric examination results. This allowed researchers to make longitudinal comparisons between individuals of the same racial lineage. Mangala's unit managed a unique database of imprisoned twins which distinguished between monozygotic and dizygotic pairs. This classification was crucial for genetic research. Weekly reports were prepared with statistical graphs showing progress or deterioration following experimental interventions. The reports were kept in coded internal files, many of which were destroyed in the camp's final days, although fragments were recovered by Soviet forces in 1945. The methodological approach included comparative organ analysis through simultaneous autopsies, tissue collection under controlled conditions, and crossover experimentation. For example, one twin could receive an immunosuppressive drug while the other acted as a control. This logic, drawn from conventional biomedical procedures, was perverted by the camp environment and applied without consent or ethical boundaries. The scientific structure behind Block 10 reveals that Mangala's atrocious acts were not simply individual excesses, but part of a meticulous system of data collection for ideological purposes. In the first phase of his experiments, twin pairs and individuals with hereditary abnormalities were placed at Dr. Mangala's disposal and underwent every specialized medical examination imaginable. They were photographed, plaster casts were made of their jaws and teeth, and their fingerprints and footprints were taken. As soon as these examinations were completed, they were killed with lethal injections of phenol into the heart so that the next phase of experimentation could begin, autopsies and comparative analysis of their internal organs. When one twin died at Auschwitz due to the camp's deplorable conditions, Mangala would order the surviving twin to be brought in and killed in cold blood just so he could perform. Experiments at Auschwitz were performed on living people. This is because another of Mangala's scientific obsessions was learning more about the importance of genetics in human development and behavior, a recurring theme among several Nazi eugenicists. Eva Moses Kor was only 10 years old in 1944 when she and her twin sister Miriam fell into Mangala's sadistic and callous hands. 3 times a week, she and her sister's arms were tied to restrict blood circulation, and their blood was drawn until they lost consciousness. While blood was being drawn from one arm, the other arm was injected with unknown substances. Since Mangala burned all of his working papers in 1945, we will never know what horrific concoctions were injected into these innocent children. On one occasion, one of these injections caused Eva to suffer an extremely high fever that left her convalescing for weeks. During one of his visits, Mangala looked at her with contempt and remarked that it was a shame she only had a couple of days to live at such a young age. However, Eva survived long enough to see the end of the war and was able to tell her story and become a human rights advocate. In some of the numerous interviews she gave over the years, Eva stated that it was only through her strong will that she managed to withstand so much pain and cruelty. Mangala expected her to die because she was no longer of much use to him as a guinea pig. But Eva knew that if she died, it would mean that her twin sister Miriam would be taken from the barracks and shot. Eva swore to herself that no matter what happened, she would protect Miriam from such a scourge. Biological experiments with deadly diseases and strange chemicals. From approximately February 1942 to April 1945, malaria experiments were conducted on over 1,200 prisoners at the Dachau concentration camp. Healthy prisoners had their hands and arms immobilized in cages filled with malaria mosquitoes. Upon contracting the disease, they were treated with synthetic drugs in doses ranging from high to lethal. Over half died as a result. Other prisoners were left with permanent disabilities. In an affidavit filed at the doctor's trial, Oswald Pohl, chief administrator of the Nazi concentration camps, testified that the malaria experiment at Dachau was the largest under his command. His testimony suggests that many more prisoners were possibly experimented on than the 1,200 documented. From June 1943 to January 1945, experiments were conducted at the Sachsenhausen and Natzweiler concentration camps to study viral hepatitis, then called epidemic jaundice. Test subjects were injected with the disease to develop new vaccines for the condition. If they died, they were buried in mass graves and new subjects were brought in to replace them. These tests were conducted for the benefit of the German armed forces, as they were very concerned about the possibility of hepatitis spreading among their troops. Most of the subjects died in the experiments, while others survived, experiencing great pain and suffering. Between December 1943 and October 1944, experiments were conducted at Buchenwald to investigate the effects of various poisons. The poisons were secretly administered to the experimental subjects in their food. The victims either died from the poison or were killed immediately to allow autopsies. In September 1944, test subjects were shot with poisoned bullets, suffered torture, and often died. Some male Jewish prisoners had poisonous substances rubbed or injected into their skin, causing boils filled with black fluid. These experiments were meticulously documented and photographed by the Nazis. On various occasions, between September 1939 and April 1945, many experiments were conducted at Sachsenhausen, Natzweiler, and other camps to investigate the most effective treatment for mustard gas injuries. Test subjects were deliberately exposed to mustard gas and other chemicals, inflicting severe chemical burns. The victims' wounds were examined to find the most effective treatment for mustard gas burns. Between November 1943 and January 1944, experiments were conducted at Buchenwald to test the effect of various pharmaceutical preparations on phosphorus burns. These burns were inflicted on prisoners with phosphorus extracted from incendiary bombs. Some female prisoners in Block 10 at Auschwitz were also subjected to electroshock therapy. These women were often ill and suffered through these experiments before being sent to the gas chambers in Nazi concentration camps involved not only SS medical teams, but also a complex logistical network that included pharmaceutical companies and Reich military pharmacies. Several German chemical companies and laboratories were implicated in the supply of substances used in forced clinical trials. Among the most notable were IG Farben, Hoechst, Schering, and Merck, which provided experimental anesthetics, antibiotics, serums, and toxic agents. These materials were routed through the Waffen-SS Medical Supply Department, headquartered in Berlin with branches in centers such as Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. The transportation of pharmaceutical compounds was managed by a centralized structure known as the Sanitätsdienst der Waffen-SS, Medical Service of the Armed SS, which operated under strict logistical guidelines. Detailed inventories of the substances in stock were maintained, and a specific distribution chain existed for research material destined for the camps. These supplies arrived in containers labeled for experimental use, and in many cases their use was documented in falsified medical records. The chemicals were transported by train or military vehicles, accompanied by authorized personnel who ensured their direct delivery to the camp medical blocks. One of the most controversial aspects of the post-1945 period was the indirect use of the data generated in these experiments by the Allies. Despite their criminal origin, many Nazi medical reports were secretly preserved and analyzed by scientific teams in the United States and the United Kingdom. in particular data on systemic infections, bacterial resistance, the effects of toxins, and physiological parameters under extreme conditions were considered unique from an experimental point of view. While not officially published, they were archived at institutions such as Camp Dietrich and the U.S. Army Medical Corps. This knowledge was discreetly applied in subsequent studies related to immunology, combat pharmacology, and epidemic control. Furthermore, during the Allied occupation of Germany, tons of medical records were seized from the facilities of IG Farben, Bayer, and other firms. Although several executives were prosecuted for war crimes at the Nuremberg trials, the companies as legal entities survived and resumed operations in the following decades. The extracted pharmaceutical documentation was partially used to fuel biological research under secret projects such as Operation Dustbin, either Operation Alsos, where scientific intelligence was merged with strategic military objectives. Between approximately July 1942 and September 1943, experiments were conducted at Ravensbrück to investigate the effectiveness of sulfonamide, a synthetic antimicrobial agent. Wounds inflicted on subjects became infected with bacteria such as Streptococcus clostridium and Streptococcus perfringens and Clostridium tetani, the causative agent of tetanus. Blood circulation was cut off by tying off the blood vessels at both ends of the wound to create a condition similar to that of a battle wound. Researchers also aggravated the subject's infection by inserting wood shavings and ground glass into their wounds. The infection was treated with sulfur drugs and other medications to determine their effectiveness. Hubertus Strughold and high-altitude human experiments. In early 1942, prisoners at the Dachau concentration camp were used by Sigmund Rascher in experiments to assist German pilots ejecting at high altitudes. A low-pressure chamber was used on these prisoners to simulate conditions at altitudes up to 68,000 feet, or 21,000 meters. It was rumored that Rascher performed vivisections on the brains of victims who survived the initial experiment. Of the 200 subjects, 80 died immediately, and the rest were killed. In a 1942 letter between Rascher and Heinrich Himmler, Rascher explains the results of a low-pressure experiment that was performed on people at the Dachau concentration camp in which the victim was suffocated while Rascher and another unnamed doctor observed their reactions. The person was described as a 37-year-old man who was healthy before being killed. Rascher described the victim's actions as he began to lose oxygen and recorded behavioral changes at intervals. The man began moving his head at 4 minutes. 1 minute later, Rascher observed him suffering from convulsions before losing consciousness. He described how the victim lay unconscious, breathing only 3 times a minute, until he stopped breathing 30 minutes after being deprived of oxygen. The victim then turned blue and began foaming at the mouth. An autopsy was performed 1 hour later. Following the end of World War II, the United States launched Operation Paperclip, a secret initiative designed to recruit German scientists, including doctors linked to the Nazi regime, with the goal of leveraging their expertise in technological and military development. Under this operation, between 1,500 and 1,800 experts were brought to the United States, avoiding denazification proceedings. Many of them had been directly involved in human experiments or in the administration of concentration camps. The selection was carried out by agencies such as the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA, in coordination with the U.S. War Department, NASA, and the newly created USAF, United States Air Force. The candidates' personal files were altered to remove all reference to their Nazi affiliation. In some cases, the original documents were classified or destroyed. To legally enter the United States, many of these scientists received new identities or special permits signed by senior military commanders. In particular, several doctors who had worked at camps such as Dachau, Buchenwald, or Sachsenhausen were recruited for their expertise in extreme physiology, space medicine, pharmacology, and neuroscience. In this context, experiments conducted on prisoners were considered valuable human data that were impossible to reproduce under conventional ethical parameters. Hubertus Strughold, whose name heads this chapter, was one of the most visible beneficiaries of this operation. However, figures such as Walter Schreiber, former Surgeon General of the Third Reich, and Kurt Blome, who had been involved in the Reich's biological weapons program. Despite the accusations documented at the Nuremberg trials, both were transferred to North America on government contracts. Schreiber ended up in a military hospital in Texas, while Blom briefly worked for U.S. intelligence services before disappearing from public view. For more than 2 decades, the role of these scientists went unnoticed by the general public. It wasn't until the 1970s that declassified documents began to emerge, revealing the full scope of Paperclip. Even then, the official justification remained. In the midst of the Cold War, the priority was to prevent these specialists from being recruited by the Soviet Union. This logic of strategic utility allowed former members of the Nazi medical establishment to collaborate in space programs, biomedical research, and U.S. government institutions without facing any legal consequences. In April 1942, Himmler ordered Russia to continue the high-altitude experiments and to continue experimenting on prisoners sentenced to death. He also ordered specific tests to determine if the men could be reanimated. If a person sentenced to death was successfully resuscitated, Himmler indicated that they should be pardoned and sent to a concentration camp for life. But Sigmund Rasche did not carry out these orders from Himmler. In fact, he faced the same fate as the people he had murdered at Dachau. When police investigations revealed that Rasche and his wife had defrauded the public by kidnapping babies to pretend they had discovered the secret of superfertility, they were arrested in April 1944. He was charged with financial irregularities, the murder of his former laboratory assistant, and scientific fraud, and taken to the Buchenwald and Dachau concentration camps before experiments were not his idea. He received orders from Hubertus Strughold, a German physiologist and medical researcher who was 45 years old in 1943. Since 1935, he had served as head of aeromedical research for Hermann's Ministry of Aviation Göring, and later held the same position with the German Luftwaffe during World War II. In 1947, he was brought to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip and went on to hold several senior scientific positions in the United States Air Force and NASA. For his role in studying the physical and psychological effects of human spaceflight, he became known as the father of space medicine. Between 1963 and 2012, he was awarded the Hubertus Prize, Strughold to outstanding scholars in applications and research in the field of space medicine. However, after 2012, the award was never awarded again, as Strughold's past was finally uncovered. In 2004, following an investigation by the Historical Committee of the German Society for Aerospace Medicine, it was discovered that in 1943, Strughold's Institute of Aviation Medicine carried out oxygen deprivation experiments. Based on these findings, 6 epileptic children, aged between 11 and 13, were transported from the Brandenburg Euthanasia Center to Strughold's laboratory in Berlin, where they were placed in vacuum chambers to induce epileptic seizures in an effort to simulate the effects of high-altitude illnesses such as hypoxia. Although, unlike the Dachau experiments, all test subjects survived the research process, this revelation led the Society of Aerospace Medicine to abolish a major award bearing Strughold's name. During World War II, hundreds of experiments were conducted on human beings in concentration camps. The fact that they were done in the name of science doesn't make them any less cruel and terrifying. Test subjects of all ages were subjected to extreme temperatures, senseless operations, deadly diseases, and even amputations, all in the name of finding a way for the Germans to dominate the world. Experiments were also conducted to find ways to kill more people more efficiently. The behavior of these doctors, who supposedly swore by Hippocrates and Apollo to protect human life, shows just how far humans are capable of depravity and senseless violence. Finally, one of the most disturbing thoughts is that just as Mangala burned his notebooks, we may never know anything about most of the horrific experiments that took place behind the locked walls of Nazi concentration camps.